Welcome back. In lessons 4 and 5 in our unit on the Communist Manifesto, we introduced revolutionary and evolutionary Marxism. In lesson 6, we take a deep dive into one Marxist thinker who not only serves as a powerful introduction to Marxism, he wants to move us beyond the revolutionary-evolutionary dichotomy into a flexible, non-dogmatic praxis that allows us to respond to real, unique dynamics across space and time. His name is Shlomo Avineri, and we're going to present his theory in an accessible way today that I've never seen anyone else do, which is kind of astonishing because when seen in the way I'm going to present it, I think it's not only hard to argue with, but it's really helpful for us to understand socialist strategy. Definitely don't miss out on the end of this lesson where we tie this whole thing together with a very useful flowchart that kind of sums up his whole theory. Here's the roadmap for today's journey through Avineri's Marx. We'll start by introducing Shlomo Avineri, who he is, and the three big threads in his reading of Marx: non-determinism, a plurality of paths to a worker's state, and Aufhebung, the dialectical tension between preserving and transcending. Next, we'll see how Avineri critiques the utopian socialists, showing why working backwards from ideals won't get us to socialism. Then we'll tackle his critique of accelerationism and why letting capitalism run its course isn't enough. Revolutionary change is always mediated by politics, organization, and institutions. From there, we'll be able to trace his theory of the path to a worker state, starting with objective structural tendencies in capitalism, like a good dialectical materialist, moving to subjective mediation, where class consciousness and organization develop, and then exploring routes to state power and institutional leverage, including the role of universal suffrage. So this third stage is really about bringing the two previous stages together. Finally, after all this groundwork, we'll be able to answer this big question about what does a worker state actually do? We'll break it down into three interrelated goals: political dismantling of bourgeois power, economic socialization of production, and human emancipation leading to the eventual transcendence of the state. By the end, you'll see how Avineri ties Marx's theory together in a practical, dynamic roadmap for revolutionary strategy, not just ideas, but a guide to political and economic action. So who is this guy? Shlomo Avineri has written a variety of books about both Marx and Hegel. Today we're going to focus on the social and political thought of Karl Marx. Avineri is widely known as a leading Hegelian interpreter of Marx. His unique and powerful interpretation of Marx puts him at odds with all kinds of people, from Leninism to Stalinism and other official statist Marxists, as well as reformist Marxists like Bernstein, all of whom we've talked about in previous lessons, so we don't have to go into too much detail here, but we're going to reference back. He's also critical of the utopian socialists and accelerationists who will be introduced in this lesson. And finally, Avineri is against what he calls religious or messianic Zionists. But tragically, as an Israeli himself, Avineri did self-identify as a Zionist. He's dead now. He was a public intellectual who even served as Director General of Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I consider his Zionism to be a major flaw in his thought, but it's very far removed from his Marxism, which is really what we need him for. That said, before you run screaming, some of the fiercest critics of Israel, like Noam Chomsky, for example, also called themselves Zionists in some sense decades ago, partly because they had a poor understanding of what Zionism was, as most of the world did for the first 50 years or so of the existence of Israel, where the real implications of what Israel took to exist hadn't really been fleshed out yet, and it was less clear. Now we know Zionism can't just be about Jewish self-determination. Jews can have self-determination in many places around the globe. We don't need Zionism for that. Zionism is about having a Jewish state. This starkly contradicts both Avineri and Chomsky's consistent rejection of Jewish supremacy, unequal rights, territorial expansion, violence against Palestinians, or any idea that religion grants anyone special privileges or ownership of land. Avineri believed he supported pluralism, democracy, and equality. According to Avineri, a Jewish state can exist alongside civic equality if its Jewish character is just cultural and political rather than ethnocratic, and if its institutions guarantee equal rights, representation, and legal protection for all its citizens. That's his argument. But to my mind, there's no way to have true equality when a state is explicitly based on identity in this way. Israel is a Jewish state. It's a unique homeland for Jews, as their 2018 basic laws say. This isn't equality. Equality implies complete de-Zionization. Okay, so we have big disagreements on that point, and I just want to acknowledge that right off the bat and challenge them before moving on to what we are really here for. I think there are three major themes in Avineri's work on Marx that distinguish him among Marxists and characterize him in such a way that they serve as a good introduction to his approach to Marx. All of these themes seek to push us beyond the debate between revolutionary and evolutionary Marxism that we've been exploring in this unit. Let's read. For Marx, the dilemma of revolution cannot be thus reduced to what later became known as the evolutionary versus the revolutionary view. From Marx's point of view, the transformation of society is always revolutionary, since it implies the transformation of the determined, that's really labor, into the determining, so labor becomes the determiner, and vice versa. This transformation, in its turn, implies a revolution in human consciousness, that is, human praxis. So Avineri wants to take us beyond the evolutionary-revolutionary binary and open a plurality of pathways to socialism, which we will dive into in this lesson. Second, although Avineri is called a determinist sometimes, I think it'll be made pretty clear in this lesson that he is anything but a determinist. Finally, we introduce the idea of Aufhebung in this lesson and the idea that the pathway to socialism is through capital. For now, we can think of Aufhebung as the idea that the way out is through. Okay. We're going to explore the different pathways to socialism in detail later in this lesson, but I want to ground that discussion right away with some textual evidence from Avineri. He writes, Marx, envisaging a broad spectrum of possibilities, maintains an undoctrinaire attitude. Gradualism may be possible in the Anglo-Saxon countries, whereas more radical means will probably have to be applied on the continent. The Communist Manifesto itself, for all its aggressive language, is singularly silent about the way in which the revolution would occur. This passage is doing a lot of work. First, it makes clear that Avineri's Marx does not offer a single fixed model of transition. There is no universal blueprint for how a worker state comes into being. Instead, Marx, on Avineri's reading, starts from historical and institutional contexts. In societies with more developed political institutions, legal systems, and democratic traditions, what Avineri calls the Anglo-Saxon countries, a more gradual, parliamentary, and institutional route may not only be possible but preferable. Here, reforms can accumulate, institutions can be transformed through universal suffrage, and working class power can be built without immediate rupture. By contrast, in societies where political institutions are weak, authoritarian, or unable to absorb mass participation, more radical and disruptive forms of struggle may be unavoidable. In these contexts, rupture is not chosen as a principle, but imposed by historical conditions. This is what puts Avineri at odds with both sides of the traditional debate. Leninists insist that a revolutionary rupture is always necessary, regardless of context. Gradualists, on the other hand, treat reform as universally sufficient. Avineri rejects both positions as doctrinaire. For him, The route to a workers' state is not predetermined. What matters is whether class power is dismantled, whether institutions are transformed, and whether universal suffrage is deepened to the point where state and society begin to merge. All this will become clear later in this lesson. In short, Avineri's Marx leaves the question of how open, because history, not theory alone, has the final say. And this brings us directly to our next theme, Avineri's non-determinism. So the second theme of non-determinism follows from the first about a plurality of paths to a worker state being possible. Avineri writes, the exact circumstances in which the revolution will be carried out cannot therefore be predetermined because such a prediction would mean that man can will the future. So here, Avineri is really showing his affinity for Hegelian philosophy. This isn't a direct quotation, but there's a general dictum for Hegel that Marx sometimes violates, which is, thou shalt not predict the future. The future is not set. All we can do is look at imminent trends within history, see their direction, and then kind of see what we can do about it. Nonetheless, Avineri has been misinterpreted by Leninist scholars like Alan Gilbert as both a determinist and a utopian socialist. Gilbert writes, Avineri combines an economic determinist view of the development of capitalism with utopianism. Workers' associations give rise not to the solidarity needed to overthrow capitalism, as Marx argued, but to proto-communist forms of life. Marx opposed all utopian ideas for overcoming capitalism, including the notion that workers' cooperatives could gradually socialize production while the capitalists held political power. It's going to be my aim to reject this reading of Avineri as a deterministic utopian throughout this lesson, but apparently Gilbert's paper was strong enough to warrant a response from Avineri himself, so let's read that now. He writes, I have to admit that at first his criticism struck me as extremely odd, as it has always been my view that the way I read Marx certainly tried to emancipate him from the mechanistic determinism which, to my mind, was added into Marxism by Engels, Plekhanov, and Kautsky. It took me some time to realize that what Gilbert calls economic determinism refers to any instance in which economic considerations were taken into account. The reason for this in Gilbert is obvious. For him, objective conditions are really bunk. What matters is the will and physical force and the readiness to use it. To me, the uniqueness of Marx's view of revolutionary praxis is that it tries to focus on the juncture where the objective economic conditions coalesce with the subjective element of will as expressed in class consciousness. This points to a recurring problem in Marxism. Everyone accuses everyone else of determinism and everyone else denies it. Avineri's position is actually quite clear. He's not claiming that economic laws mechanistically dictate history, nor is he denying the role of contingency, politics, or rupture. He's following the logic of economic development, not asserting its inevitability. Crucially, Avineri insists that revolution emerges only where objective conditions and subjective will intersect. Economic development alone is insufficient, but sheer voluntarism is equally empty. Voluntarism is the idea that political will, moral commitment, or sheer force can create socialism independently of material conditions, as if history could be reshaped by intention alone, rather than through the constraints and possibilities set by existing economic and social structures. At the end of this passage, Avineri explicitly affirms revolution when that convergence occurs. This is not fatalism, but a theory of mediated, historically grounded praxis. Alongside his rejection of determinism and his insistence on multiple possible pathways to socialism, a third major thread in Avineri's reading of Marx is this: to get beyond capitalism, we have to pass through it. Socialism is not inevitable. Authoritarianism or barbarism or both at once remain real possibilities. But if there is a path to socialism at all, capitalism is historically central to it at the level of global political economy. He writes, the possibility for a development in the direction of communism thus depends on a prior development of capitalism. As will be shown later in this chapter, communism is nothing else than the dialectical abolition, Aufhebung, of capitalism, postulating the realization of those hidden potentialities which could not have been historically realized under the limiting conditions of capitalism. Capitalism thus creates urges that it cannot itself satisfy, and it is in this sense that Marx refers to its digging its own grave. Therefore, Marx knows no shortcuts to socialism. This passage is not an apology for capitalism. It's a dialectical claim. Capitalism generates real historical capacities, productive forces, global interdependence, socialized labor, and universalizing pressures that it cannot itself govern without crisis. Communism does not discard these capacities, it transforms them. A fair concern immediately arises. Does this mean we must sit back and allow capitalism to devastate indigenous or non-capitalist societies? Especially given Avineri's Zionist background, that question matters. That's a fair question. But this is not what Avineri or Marx are claiming. Marx is describing a general global process, not prescribing a single developmental path for every people or justifying conquest or genocide. As we've seen, Avineri explicitly affirms a plurality of paths to socialism, even while recognizing capitalism as the dominant global system shaping them. The key concept holding this together is Aufhebung. Taken from Hegel, it means both abolition and preservation. Socialism emerges not by wiping the slate clean, but by transforming capitalism's achievements beyond their capitalist form. As Marx puts it, the new society matures in the womb of the old. That's why Aufhebung is not about shortcuts. It asks a harder question. How do we move forward from where we actually are, carrying the past with us even as we transcend it? For Avineri, this clarity is one of Marx's greatest strengths. Let's sharpen this point by exploring Avineri's critique of utopian socialism. Okay, now let's move on to first understand what utopian socialism is all about, and then explain why Avineri is not one. In 1880, Friedrich Engels published Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, a short but enormously influential book. In it, Engels criticizes some of socialism's major early forerunners, Saint-Simon, Robert Owen, and Charles Fourier. Importantly, Engels is not criticizing them for being naive or for wanting unrealistic things, which is what we usually think of when we talk about utopianism. His critique is way more precise. He argues that they were idealistic in the philosophical sense, idealistic in the same way Engels read Hegel. That is, they believed that ideas drive history rather than material and economic forces. The utopian socialists worked backwards. They began with a vision of a just, harmonious socialist future and then tried to reason their way back to the present. Socialism for them emerged from the human mind, from moral insight, rational planning, or imaginative design. They then attempted to implant these ideas in society, often through small-scale experiments meant to model the future in the present, and then spread those models through propaganda and advertising, and they would just do so well that they would want to spread naturally. Marx and Engels wanted to reverse this method entirely. Instead of starting with ideals, they started with material conditions. how people actually produce, work, exchange, and live. Let's hear Engels explain this critique directly. He says, the solution of the social problems which as yet lay hidden in undeveloped economic conditions, the utopians attempted to evolve out of the human brain. Society presented nothing but wrongs. To remove these was the task of reason. It was necessary then to discover a new and more perfect system of social order and to impose this upon society from without by propaganda, and wherever it was possible by the example of model experiments. These new social systems were foredoomed as utopian. The more completely they were worked out in detail, the more they could not avoid drifting off into pure fantasies. This passage gets to the heart of Engels' objection. The utopians treated socialism as a blueprint, a perfect system to be designed in advance and then applied to society. They tried to persuade people through moral appeal, education, or exemplary communities rather than grounding socialism in real historical forces. For Marx and Engels, this is precisely backwards. Socialism cannot be invented and imposed from the outside. It must emerge from the contradictions, struggles, and capacities produced by capitalism itself. This is the shift from utopian socialism to scientific socialism, from ideas shaping history to material conditions shaping ideas and opening real possibilities for transformation. That reversal is foundational for everything that follows in Avineri's reading of Marx. Engels puts the break with utopian socialism as clearly as possible here. After the 1830s, socialism was no longer an accidental discovery of this or that ingenious brain, but the necessary outcome of the struggle between two historically developed classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. That sentence flips the meaning of socialism. It's no longer something designed by thinkers, but something that emerges from real social conflict produced by capitalism itself. Engels goes on, socialism's task was no longer to manufacture a system of society as perfect as possible, but to examine the historico-economic succession of events from which these classes and their antagonism had of necessity sprung, and to discover in the economic conditions thus created the means of ending the conflict. This is the materialist turn. Socialism is grounded in analysis, not imagination. It grows out of capitalism's own contradictions, not from moral blueprints imposed from the outside. And that is why earlier socialism, as Engels says, was incompatible with this materialist conception. It mistook ideals for engines of history. This shift is decisive for everything that follows in Marx and in Avineri's reading. Socialism is not a model to copy, it's a historical possibility that must be realized through struggle using the capacities capitalism itself has already created. Avineri fully internalizes Engels' break with utopian socialism, and he explains why Marx spent his life analyzing capitalism rather than designing blueprints for socialism. He writes, Marx's decision to devote most of his life to a systematic study of capitalism, contenting himself with occasional remarks about the structure of socialist society, can be explained by methodological considerations. The key issue here is method. Marx is not silent about socialism because he lacks imagination, but because speculation without material grounding reproduces utopianism. Avineri continues, as utopian socialism, because of its failure to grasp the nature of existing reality, also cannot come to grips with the future, so Marx's claim to understand the present gives him a clue to the ultimate trends of history operating within capitalist society. That word clue matters enormously. A clue is not a prediction, a law, or a historical guarantee. It means that by grasping capitalism's inner logic, its contradictions, tendencies, and limits, right now, we can see possible futures imminent within it, not inevitabilities, possibilities. Avineri drives this point home. Utopianism develops scientific theories which exist only in the head of the thinker because it does not have reality as its object. Marx, by contrast, insists on starting from reality as it exists. This is why, as Avineri notes, Marx refuses an abstract definition of communism and instead speaks of communist society as it has just emerged after prolonged birth pangs from capitalist society. This is classic dialectical materialism. The future is not invented, it is born out of the present, shaped by struggle and contradiction. That's why this resonates so strongly with Rosa Luxemburg's claim that the most revolutionary act is to say out loud what is happening. Revolution begins not with fantasy, but with clarity. Understanding the present is itself a material political act. And for Avineri's Marx, it is the only serious starting point for socialism. Okay, now that we've seen how Avineri's method is not only antithetical to utopianism, but that he explicitly rejects it, let's see how his theory also differs from another problematic trend in socialist thought, accelerationism. Accelerationism in the Marxist context is the idea that capitalism should be allowed or even encouraged to develop according to its own internal logic, because that development will intensify its contradictions and eventually create the conditions for its own transformation. The basic claim is not that capitalism is good or just, but that it's historically necessary. Only once capitalism fully matures can the social forces capable of overcoming it come into existence. Classical accelerationist arguments draw on Marx's claim that no social order ever disappears before all the productive forces it can contain have developed. If remnants of older systems like feudal privileges, mercantilism, or protectionism continue to restrain capitalism, then its contradictions remain muted and its transformative potential incomplete. In this sense, removing pre-capitalist constraints allows capitalism to become itself, revealing both its productive power and its structural limits. However, accelerationism becomes controversial when this logic is turned into a political strategy. In its strongest form, it suggests that socialists should not resist exploitation, austerity, or market expansion because worsening conditions will automatically generate crisis and revolutionary consciousness. This is where many critics object, arguing that crises do not produce emancipation on their own. They can just as easily lead to authoritarianism, fragmentation, or defeat. For thinkers like Avineri, Marx's position only appears accelerationist in a very limited sense. Capitalism may generate conditions for change, but transformation is never automatic. It depends on political struggle, organization, and consciousness, not on history running on autopilot. Before we get to Avineri's critique, let's see what basis accelerationists have within Marx's own writing. The classic example accelerationists point to in Marx's writing is his analysis of the repeal of the Corn Laws in Britain in 1846. The Corn Laws were tariffs on imported grain that protected landowners while keeping bread prices high for workers. Their repeal lowered food prices, which appeared to benefit workers, but Marx argued that capitalists would soon claw back those gains by lowering wages towards subsistence. For that reason, many socialists opposed repeal as a bourgeois trick. Marx agreed with the analysis, but still welcomed the repeal, and Avineri explains why. He writes, Marx sees the repeal of the Corn Laws as a Pyrrhic victory for the bourgeoisie. By the way, a Pyrrhic victory means a victory won at too great a cost for the victors. Repeal abolished the last mercantilistic, pre-capitalist encumbrance on the free play of market economy. Now the way was open to an unfettered expansion of capitalism. Such a development could not but lead to the intensive emergence of the proletariat and the imposition of novel revolutionary limitations on the economic activity of the market. This helps clarify Marx's famously confusing claim that no social order ever perishes before all the productive forces it can contain have matured within it. Here, unfettered does not mean neoliberal free market dogma, it means capitalism freed from pre-capitalist distortions, mercantilism, protectionism, and feudal privileges, so its contradictions can fully emerge. Avineri continues, the immediate results of repeal were beneficial to the bourgeoisie and detrimental to the workers. Nonetheless, Marx welcomes it. For only now will economic activity be regulated according to the capitalist free market model. Only now will it develop those forces that will change it from the inside. So long as any limitations on the free functioning of the model exist, it cannot develop towards change. For this reason, Marx heartily welcomed the repeal of the Corn Laws, while most other socialists bitterly resented it. Okay, that's a really confusing way to put it, but the crucial point is this. Marx does not welcome capitalism because it is just or humane, but because once fully developed, it generates the contradictions for its own transformation. This is the limited sense in which Marx can appear accelerationist, but Avineri sharply rejects contemporary accelerationism's fatalism. Crisis is not automatic. Collapse is not guaranteed. Capitalism can just as easily yield authoritarianism or barbarism. For Avineri, contradictions become emancipatory only when they are politically mediated through class consciousness, organization, and institutions. Accelerationism without mediation is not Marxism, it's abdication. Let's pause and get precise about Avineri and accelerationism because they overlap, but only to a point. First, both agree that capitalism has been historically progressive. It broke feudalism, expanded productive capacity, and loosened older forms of domination. Capitalism is not just stagnation, it develops forces history didn't have before. Second, both agree that capitalism is internally contradictory. It's not an end state. Its own logic generates crises, economic, social, and political, that demand resolution in a new form of society. Capitalism is not the end of history, as some like to say. Third, both reject reforms as an end goal. Welfare, labor protections, or regulation alone cannot resolve capitalism's contradictions. Transformation must go beyond patching the system. Now, here's where accelerationism diverges. Accelerationists tend to see history as quasi-deterministic. Let capitalism develop freely, intensify its contradictions, and crisis will almost inevitably open the door to socialism. They focus on acute crisis, state breakdown, collapse, rupture as the decisive moment, often modeled on the example of Russia in 1917. And they generally argue that capitalist development should be accelerated before workers take power, even at the cost of immiseration, to force that crisis. All right, now Avineri's position. He rejects determinism outright. Socialism is possible, not inevitable. Capitalism can just as easily produce authoritarianism or barbarism or both at once. For Avineri, crisis is chronic, not exceptional. Inequality, war, ecological destruction, and alienation are already ongoing crises. We don't need to wait for a final collapse. Life under capitalism is one big crisis. Most importantly, Aveniri insists that workers must win political power first through universal suffrage, organization, institutions, and sometimes rupture, and only then consciously guide capitalist dynamics towards socialism. So the core difference is this: accelerationists want to accelerate capitalism before democratic worker control. Aveniri insists acceleration must happen after the working class has conquered political power. That difference is everything. Let's go back to this controversial idea that there's a kind of free market Marx that Aveniri is trying to recover. He writes, only after external hindrances were abolished could capitalism develop towards internal change. That's a provocative claim. On the surface, it sounds like Marx is saying capitalism won't develop towards socialism unless we let the free market do its thing, a kind of radical version of the idea that the way out is through. But we need to be very clear about what Aveniri means by external hindrances. This is not a blanket endorsement of laissez-faire capitalism. What Marx and Aveniri have in mind are pre-capitalist obstacles still clinging to modern society. Mercantilism, feudal privileges, colonial monopolies, landed protectionism. These are residues of the past that distort capitalism's own logic and prevent its logic from coming into being. That's why the repeal of the Corn Laws matters so much. It wasn't just about cheaper bread, it was about abolishing protectionist barriers rooted in landed power. Removing those barriers allowed capitalism to operate according to its own logic so that its contradictions could fully emerge. In that sense, freeing the market means freeing it from the past, not freeing it from all regulation. This opens a real debate. Are all forms of protectionism bad, or is Marx only opposing protectionism tied to feudal and colonial domination? Aveniri's Marx clearly does not oppose regulation as such. External hindrances does not mean worker protections, social reforms, or democratic control. It means archaic obstacles that prevent capitalism from becoming itself. We see this clearly in Marx's support of the factory laws, which I've summarized here on the left. Aveniri writes, the factory laws which set a legal limit on the working day thus undoubtedly infringe on the laissez-faire model of freedom of contract. All these elements introduce into the free market economy aspects of community-oriented considerations and contribute further to social change. This is the key qualification. Marx supports reforms that limit the market when they represent post-capitalist tendencies, collective regulation, social responsibility, and democratic constraints on capital. The repeal of the Corn Laws removes feudal remnants. The factory laws introduce social limits. So Aveniri's Marx is not a free market absolutist, and he's not an accelerationist in the modern sense either. The point is not immiseration, crisis engineering, or letting capital run wild. The point is this: capitalism cannot clearly generate its own contradictions if it is still governed by pre-capitalist logics. The way out is not blind faith in the market, but conscious political agency, democratic intervention, and the organized struggle to end class domination. That's the distinction Aveniri wants us to grasp, and it's where most debates about accelerationism go so wrong. The implication of this entire discussion about pre and post capitalist developments inside actually existing capitalism is this. For Avineri, there is no such thing as real historical free market capitalism. That idea only exists as an abstract model. In real history, every mode of production is always stamped by what comes before it and what is already emerging after it. Capitalism has never existed in a pure form. It has always been burdened by pre-capitalist remnants, primitive accumulation, colonial plunder, feudal privilege, or already constrained by post-capitalist reforms designed to limit the market's destructive effects on human life. There's a fascinating philosophy of time here. It's almost as if capitalism never fully existed as a stable present. We're always either before it or after it, or most often both at once. Avineri puts this beautifully. He writes, England, the country of the realized model of capitalism, has already moved beyond the model. The model cannot ultimately exist as an historical reality. Since all historical reality is always in a process of becoming, the model is either a criterion for a reality developing towards it, or if adequacy between model and reality is maximized, internal circumstances have given rise to a reality that has overtaken the model and moved farther and farther away from it. England, having realized the capitalist model has moved already beyond the point at which the model can serve as an adequate explication of its mode of production. The takeaway is striking. The moment capitalism most closely approximates its theoretical model is also the moment it begins to outgrow it. The model can guide analysis, but it can never fully describe lived reality, and this connects directly to Karl Polanyi's idea of the double movement of history. In his book, The Great Transformation, from the beginning, capitalism pushes toward marketization, but that push immediately provokes social resistance, public outrage, and demands for protection. Market expansion and social regulation always arise together. There was never a pure free market followed later by regulation. No, the two emerge simultaneously. Avineri's Marx fits perfectly here. Capitalism is always internally split between inherited constraints and emerging limits. That's why talk of letting the free market run completely misses the point. Historically, the free market has never existed and could not exist except as an abstraction. Now let's move on to understand Shlomo Avineri's theory of revolutionary strategy, which I've formalized into this chart to make things as clear as possible. There's really two moments here. The first is about the path to a worker state, and the second is about the goals of the worker state culminating in its own Aufhebung, or abolition. Like a good materialist, Avineri begins with capital's already existing material reality, or what's called capital's objective tendency. This gives rise to a subjective socialist consciousness that turns back and mediates capital, and this dialectic opens up pathways to state power and deep socialist institutional power. Once the workers have achieved this, once we control the state, there are three moments or goals to overcome both capital and the centralized state as something that stands over and above civil society. All of these relate to achieving full, deep, and real universal suffrage, or a politics that represents the people. The first step is dismantling bourgeois class power in government, the second is the socialization of the economy, and the third is about creating such a society that the coercive state is no longer necessary and can finally wither away. Okay, let's get into it. Now that we've laid out Avineri's critique of utopian socialism and accelerationism, let's shift gears and see what his reading of Marx can tell us about the arduous path towards a worker state. The manifesto reads, "The first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to win the battle of democracy." This is kind of the whole ball game in that this is where we're at right now. Okay. First, the claim is that there are structural tendencies already growing within capitalism that set the stage for further developments, but they are not always pleasant or positive in themselves. The first is universalization of social relations. People increasingly relate to one another not as members of a feudal state, caste, or religion, but as participants in the same socioeconomic system. Globalization means capitalism spreads to distant lands and climes, as the manifesto puts it. Proletarianization is about the workforce growing in strength and in number, and the socialization of capital is about the transition from single proprietor companies to large enterprises owned publicly through the stock market. More on all this in a moment. Okay, the second step here is that these objective material tendencies immanent to capital, within capital, have subjective consequences that can mediate them. We can't rely on the cold logic of capital to lead us to the promised land. No, our political agency is crucial to mediate this historical process. The emergence of class consciousness isn't just done by having the right conversations or ideas. This is done through real material organizations. We need to build class consciousness through organizations and institutions like unions, political parties, and cooperatives, and a lot more. We'll get into this in a moment. Step 3, now that we have some institutional power, we can build on that to effect change. Parliamentary and legal reforms could build a strong welfare state and subject finance to public control. Now we can expand institutions. Cooperatives can syndicate, they can come together. Trade unions can expand into municipal governance, and much more. The belief here is that law is a terrain of struggle, not a bourgeois illusion as the Leninists would have it. That said, Avineri does not dismiss strategic revolutionary ruptures where possible and feasible. Okay, now let's go into detail and see how the path to a worker state is contingent and therefore plural and always mediated by class consciousness. The first tendency immanent to capitalism that becomes a precondition for its eventual Aufhebung or abolition is the universalization of social relations, the spread of abstract, impersonal forms of social mediation across society. Okay, what does that mean? Well, at its core, it's about abstract interdependence. Under capitalism, individuals no longer relate primarily through feudal ties, caste, or personal obligation. Money, markets, and law become king. They become the dominant mediators of social life. Where pre-capitalist societies bound people through kinship, guilds, or locality, capitalism integrates everyone into a system that extends far beyond the village or family. A farmer in Iowa is structurally linked to a factory in China, consumers in Europe, and investors in New York. These connections are invisible, systemic, and unavoidable. Capitalism does not merely facilitate exchange, it organizes society into a single interconnected network of production, trade, and governance. This is why crises propagate globally rather than remaining local, as the 2008 financial crash made unmistakably clear. Economic and social actions in one part of the system reverberate through the whole. Crucially, this universalization is a precondition for collective action. By drawing everyone into the same social structure, capitalism makes possible class consciousness and coordinated struggle. workers cease to be isolated peasants or artisans and instead come to realize themselves as part of a shared social position within a total system. The capacity for collective organization and democratic social control emerges from the very networks capitalism creates. In this sense, universalization is both capitalism's greatest strength and its latent vulnerability. It binds society together through abstract domination, but those same connections make collective emancipatory action conceivable. Capitalism constructs the stage on which it can ultimately be challenged and potentially overcome, right? If the whole system is connected, then a strike in one part of the system can affect the whole system. So this interconnection opens up revolutionary potential. Obviously, related to the universalization of social relations is the second structural tendency, globalization. Under capitalism, production, trade, and exchange are not confined to local or national boundaries. They spread across regions and nations, tying distant peoples, resources, and markets into a single interdependent system. Globalization is capitalism expanding geographically. It creates a world in which economic and social life is increasingly interconnected. As Avineri explains, Marx saw this expansion as structurally necessary. Capitalism cannot reach its full development while large regions of the world remain outside its reach. So Avineri writes, citing Marx, so long as this universality of the market has not reached its ultimate geographical limit, capitalism has not yet reached its apex. Only when this process reached its culmination with the opening of Japan and China to Western trade and the discovery of gold in Australia and California, only then could the internal process of decomposition and change be expected to start. Globalization is not just the spread of goods and capital. It's the social and structural integration of a world under capitalist rules. It creates conditions for universal interdependence as local economic shocks, innovations, or conflicts reverberate globally. It also lays the groundwork for class consciousness on a larger scale. Workers, consumers, and communities are linked in a single social system, making collective awareness and coordinated struggle conceivable beyond local or national limits. A major issue here is that globalization is materialized in the real world through coercion, uneven development, genocide, and destruction of indigeneity and tradition. So my question for Avineri would be, if globalization is a prerequisite for a worker state, how can we integrate the world economy democratically without gentrification, genocide, or the destruction of indigenous traditions? Either way, capitalism builds the stage on which it can be challenged. Its global reach is both the source of oppression and the potential for collective revolutionary transformation. That's the claim, anyway. Okay, time for some extra credit. If you want more textual evidence to explore globalization, I invite you to have a look at these quotations from Avineri and the Manifesto, but for the sake of reducing video length, I won't read them to you, so go ahead and pause here and read if you like. The third structural tendency immanent to capitalism within capitalism that points beyond capitalism is proletarianization. As we discussed in Lesson 2, proletarianization refers to the process by which people who once had some control over their livelihoods, small farmers, artisans, shopkeepers, are displaced by large-scale capital and compelled to sell their labor power for a wage to those big companies. So what matters here is not simply poverty, but the loss of independent access to the means of life. The proletarianization of women is a special case. Women historically did not own the means of production in the same way men did, but they exercised control over what Marxist feminists call the reproduction of labor power, feeding workers, maintaining households, and raising the next generation of laborers. But during World War II, American capitalism faced a severe labor shortage, and capital responded by drawing women directly into wage labor. This was not emancipation driven by equality, but a labor driven strategic inclusion captured by iconic wartime imagery like Rosie the Riveter here. Capital expands by pulling ever more people into wage labor. All right. What Avineri emphasizes most in proletarianization is universal alienation. He writes, only alienation universalizes the worker. Only a universal mode of production can give rise to a class of universal significance. Alienation does not morally elevate workers, nor does suffering automatically generate revolutionary consciousness. Instead, alienation strips workers of particularistic identities at the level of production. Workers become interchangeable bearers of labor power, and exploitation becomes structurally common. This is what gives the proletariat its universal significance. Unlike peasants, small proprietors, or artisans, the proletariat has no partial interests to defend. No land, no shops, no inherited privileges binding it to the existing order. If your farm, store, or livelihood has already been destroyed by large capital, why defend private property at all? Stripped of independent holdings, the proletariat comes to recognize that it cannot emancipate itself without abolishing capitalism itself. Small-scale enterprises may persist, but they cannot secure emancipation. For Avineri's Marx, proletarian struggle is universal, not because workers are morally superior, but because their liberation requires transforming the entire system. Its ethical significance lies not in virtue, but in its potential to abolish domination as such. The fourth structural tendency imminent to capitalism that points beyond capitalism is the socialization of capital. Here, production becomes a collective, cooperative, and interdependent process, while ownership and control of the results of that labor remain privately concentrated. Okay, what does that mean in practice? There are two moments at work here, and the first concerns the forces of production, especially labor itself. In feudalism and early capitalism, production could still appear individual. A craftsman in a workshop or a farmer working their own land. As capitalism develops, however, production is reorganized on a vast social scale. Factories, assembly lines, global supply chains, and digital platforms coordinate the labor of hundreds, thousands, and even millions of workers. So no individual worker produces a commodity alone now. Every product is the outcome of collective labor, coordinated through complex systems of planning, technology, and management. In this sense, the socialization of capital overlaps directly with globalization. The second moment concerns the relations of production, especially ownership. In feudalism and early capitalism, productive enterprises were typically owned by single individuals or families. As capitalism develops, ownership tends to become formally collective through joint stock companies, pension funds, and public markets. Capital is increasingly pooled and socially distributed in form, even as effective control remains concentrated in the hands of a relatively small capitalist class. A vast network of workers cooperate to produce social wealth, yet decisions about investment, production, and distribution are still privately made. This contradiction between forces and relations is decisive for Marx and central to Avineri's reading. One major effect of this socialization is the deepening of interdependence among workers themselves. Workers are linked not only to capital, but to one another across firms, sectors, and even countries, as we've been talking about. A breakdown or an organized strike in one part of the production process can disrupt the entire system. This shared dependence creates the material basis for solidarity, organization, and collective action. Though, as Avineri insists, these outcomes are never automatic. Here's the key point. The transition from isolated, single proprietor enterprises to a vast network of socially owned but privately controlled capital demonstrates that capitalism already relies on collective labor and collective coordination. Planning, cooperation, and large-scale organization are not foreign to capitalism, they're its everyday operating principles. What remains irrational is not socialized production, but private control over it. So we now have a grasp of the four real material structural tendencies already at work within capitalism or imminent to capitalism. If these are the objective tendencies, let's move on to analyze the second moment of Avineri's path to a worker state, the subjective tendencies. This is the impact that these material dynamics have on consciousness, or rather, if the objective tendencies create the opportunities for socialism, it's up to our human agency to seize them and make the most of them. Avineri's point is that something is lost in this transition from objective to subjective, and that is any trace of determinism. Nothing about class consciousness itself is predetermined or guaranteed. It's up to us to mobilize and create institutions that can challenge the hegemony of capital. We call this subjective mediation to highlight that we need to do something to achieve socialism. We can't just sit back, kick our feet up, and let the cold march of capital lead us to full communism. That's not what Aufhebung is about. All right, so let's go into subjective mediation now. The second moment in Avineri's path to a worker state is subjective mediation, the idea that capitalism's structural tendencies do not automatically lead beyond capitalism. They must be mediated through conscious political activity. The first moment of this mediation is class consciousness. For Avineri's Marx, class consciousness is not simply a matter of awareness, education, or adopting the correct ideas. It's not produced by moral outrage alone, nor by intellectual persuasion in the abstract. Rather, class consciousness emerges through material experience and collective practice. As global capitalism universalizes social relations, proletarianizes the population, and socializes labor, workers increasingly share a common structural position. They confront similar conditions of exploitation, alienation, and insecurity. But this shared position does not automatically generate consciousness. What transforms a class in itself into a class for itself is organization and struggle. This is why Avineri insists on the importance of our agency and practice, which begins with class consciousness. He writes, if a revolutionary consciousness exists, then the revolution is bound to happen. In other words, under these conditions, the revolution is already taking place. If, on the other hand, such a consciousness is lacking, then the revolution lacks its main impulse and is stillborn. This is not voluntarism. Avineri is not claiming that ideas alone make revolutions. Rather, he's arguing that without consciousness, even the most advanced material conditions remain politically inert. Capitalism can generate crisis after crisis, but crisis alone does not act. Class consciousness is produced through organization, unions, political parties, cooperatives, and collective struggles over wages, rights, and social power. Through these practices, workers learn that their problems are not individual failures, but systemic features of capitalism. Consciousness is forged in action, not merely in theory. Avineri emphasizes that class consciousness is historical, uneven, and fragile. It develops through defeats as well as victories, and it can just as easily fragment under nationalism, racism, or competition if it's not actively sustained. In this sense, class consciousness is the subjective counterpart to capitalism's objective tendencies. Capitalism creates the conditions for collective awareness, but only conscious organization can turn those conditions into political agency. Without this mediation, no worker state is possible. Class consciousness takes us to the second moment of subjective mediation in Avineri's path to a worker state: building organizational power. If class consciousness is the recognition of a shared structural position formed through material experience, organizational power is how that consciousness is made durable, effective, and politically consequential. Without organization, consciousness remains episodic and fragile. Gains are lost as easily as they are won. With organization, political victories can be maintained and built upon. A persistent theme I'm trying to hammer home here is that in dialectical materialism, consciousness is not treated as an autonomous realm that floats above social life. Instead, consciousness becomes historically real only through material social activity. For Avineri, consciousness does not float above society. It must be embedded in institutions, trade unions, political parties, cooperatives, workers' councils, and social movements. They're all the means through which class consciousness is stabilized over time, transmitted across generations, and translated into collective action. Organization is not simply an instrument of class struggle, it's the form through which class consciousness is reproduced and strengthened. This is where Avineri distinguishes himself from both Bernstein, the gradualist, and Lenin, the ruptural advocate. Edward Bernstein argues that institutions and reforms are sufficient in themselves by expanding democracy, welfare, and legal protections. Capitalism can gradually evolve into socialism without a fundamental rupture. For Bernstein, reform becomes not a means, but an endpoint. Lenin rejects this completely. His strategy centers on building one primary institution, the Communist Party, and using it to seize state power through a decisive rupture. Existing institutions such as parliaments, trade unions, and legal systems are treated largely as bourgeois structures that limit revolutionary potential rather than develop it. Avineri charts a different course. He insists that institutions are neither inherently bourgeois nor inherently revolutionary. They are terrains of struggle. Law, parliaments, welfare systems, and public administration are not illusions to be discarded, but arenas in which power can be accumulated, defended, and expanded. Institutional engagement does not negate revolutionary possibility, it can prepare the ground for it. At the same time, Avineri rejects reformist complacency. Ruptures may be appropriate in certain historical contexts, and reforms are valuable only insofar as they mediate capital toward worker control of the state. Organization does not guarantee success. Institutions can ossify, bureaucratize, or be captured by capital if they lose contact with active struggle. What matters then is not any single organization, but an ecology of institutions mediating between workers and the state, between economic struggle and political power, and organizational power is the material bridge between consciousness and state power. It's how a class learns to govern before it governs. For Avineri, a worker state is rarely seized first and built later. It must be prepared through institutions that already embody collective power in practice. Now that we have a grasp of the first two moments in Avineri's path to a worker state, the objective tendencies of capitalism, which create the opportunity for the rise of our ability to subjectively mediate capital through class consciousness and organizational power, we can see how this dialectic opens up a plurality of routes to state power. What I like is how the objective and subjective tendencies come together and unite to open routes to state power. These routes are the unity of the two previous different moments. Avineri's point is not to foreclose on any of these possibilities. Rather, he critiques both Leninists who insist on a single violent rupture and gradualists who assume reforms alone are sufficient. With this context in mind, let's explore what these multiple paths actually look like. One of the routes to state power that Avineri emphasizes is parliamentary and legal reforms. This path does not bypass the working class or the need for class consciousness and organizational power. Rather, it builds on these foundations to gradually extend workers' influence within state structures. So reforms are not the end goal, as the gradualists suggest, and they're not distractions, as Leninist rupturalism claims. They're means of mediating capitalism towards social control by the working class. Through parliaments, legal systems, and constitutional processes, the working class can achieve practical gains that prepare the way for a worker state. Regulating finance through public banking, capital controls, limits on speculative activity, or monopoly regulation disciplines capital and redirects investment towards social needs. Public banking belongs to Route 1 when it is created through legislation, operates as a state institution, and is accountable to public authorities. Examples include national development banks, postal banking systems, and public infrastructure banks. Capital controls regulate money flows across borders, such as taxes on short-term flows, restrictions on capital flight, or approval requirements for large foreign investments. Limits on speculative activity include financial transaction taxes, restrictions on derivative trading, leveraging caps, and separation of commercial and investment banking. Monopoly regulation, like antitrust laws or limits on mergers, reduces the ability of a few corporations to dominate markets, ensuring collective planning and democratic oversight. Legal reforms can also expand social welfare through universal health care, pensions, UBI or some kind of guaranteed income, public housing or unemployment insurance, and a whole lot more. Protecting and expanding labor rights through collective bargaining, workplace safety laws, and anti-dismissal protections strengthens workers' capacity to organize. Developing infrastructure, transport, energy, communication, and housing lays the material foundation for collective provision and democratic planning. These measures stabilize and strengthen collective organization while showing that state institutions are not monolithic. Law and parliamentary procedures are terrains of struggle, providing openings for negotiation, intervention, and the accumulation of governing experience by the workers. Each reform both protects workers and prepares them for deeper transformations, prefiguring a worker state without relying exclusively on rupture. At the same time, Avineri cautions against reformist complacency. Reforms can be reversed or hollowed out if disconnected from unions, cooperatives, and mass movements. In short, parliamentary and legal reforms are a strategic lever in Avineri's pluralist approach, allowing workers to exercise power, accumulate governing capacity, and mediate capital, including finance and monopoly, toward collective control without abandoning revolutionary aims. The second route to state power in Avineri's framework is pre-worker state institution building. It builds directly on level 2, subjective mediation, where class consciousness is formed and basic organizational capacity is developed. But in level 3, that mediation becomes deeper, more durable, and materially effective, whereas subjective mediation focuses on the emergence of class consciousness and early organizational forms. Level 3 institutional power embeds that consciousness in institutions capable of sustained governance, coordination, and collective control. The crucial shift is not the appearance of new institutions necessarily, but a change in what existing institutions are able to do. This explains why many of the same institutions appear in both stages. In level 2, which is about subjective mediation, unions, councils, cooperatives, and municipal bodies primarily focus on forming consciousness, coordinating struggle, and defending gains. In level 3, these institutions deepen in function and capacity. Unions begin to administer pensions, training systems, or workplace standards. Workers' councils move from voicing demands to participating directly in workplace and social governance. Municipal councils shift from lobbying higher authorities to exercising democratic control over things like housing, transportation, energy, and public services. Cooperatives evolve from isolated enterprises into federated networks or syndicates, coordinating production, credit even, and distribution beyond the firm level. Additional institutions further extend this transformation. Credit unions and public-oriented financial institutions redirect savings towards social needs rather than private accumulation. Mutual aid networks organize care and survival outside the market, reducing dependence on commodified services. Social movements and political parties translate local struggles into society-wide priorities. Housing cooperatives and public service collectives bring democratic control into everyday life and social reproduction. Avineri's institution building is decentralized in its development, emerging bottom-up through a network of institutions. This decentralization allows workers to build real governing capacity through participation rather than top-down command. However, Avineri does not envision permanent decentralization like the anarchists. This is because we need to challenge modern production and capital, which are highly centralized and interdependent. Instead, for Avineri, local institutions are meant to federate, coordinate, and scale, creating democratic forms of centralization. But who knows, if we overcome capitalism, maybe we can gradually decentralize while remaining federated through mutual consent rather than any top-down coercion inherent to any centralized body. But we'll get there in a little bit later when we talk about the Aufhebung of the state as a goal of the worker state. To sum up here, Level 3 institutions are central for Avineri because it allows workers to govern before they govern. Through institutional practice, they gain real experience managing resources, coordinating collective labor, and exercising democratic oversight. This practical capacity strengthens Route 1, enhancing the ability to leverage parliamentary representatives, legal reforms, and public policy. At the same time, it prepares the ground for rupture where necessary, ensuring that organized, experienced structures already exist. The third route to state power in Avineri's framework is rupture, strategic, discontinuous action that challenges the existing order. Unlike routes 1 and 2, which work through gradual institutional embedding, rupture focuses on moments of crisis or opportunity where the working class can assert power in ways that normal channels of politics and organization cannot. At first glance, this may sound Leninist. Lenin emphasized the necessity of a decisive break. The Communist Party must seize the state through revolution, bypassing or even smashing existing institutions, which he often saw as inherently bourgeois and constraining. Lenin's approach relied on democratic centralization. Power and decision making were concentrated in the party, which acted as a disciplined vanguard to direct the revolution. Legal and institutional engagement was largely secondary or instrumental. Avineri shares with Lenin the recognition that rupture may sometimes be necessary, especially in contexts where capitalism's contradictions erupt violently or where reformist paths are blocked. He also agrees that transformative change occasionally requires confrontation and rapid seizure of power. However, Avineri's approach is fundamentally different. Rupture is contingent, tactical, and deeply integrated with institutional power. Unlike Lenin, Avineri does not centralize authority in a vanguard. His institutions are decentralized in development, emerging bottom up through unions, cooperatives, workers' councils, and municipal bodies. Successful rupture depends on a broad, organized, conscious working class already exercising power through these institutions. Existing structures are not obstacles to be smashed, they are resources and terrains of struggle. So in Avineri's vision, rupture is a lever within a pluralist strategy, accelerating or consolidating gains when conditions demand it. Legal reforms, cooperative networks, and municipal councils are not abandoned. They strengthen the capacity for rupture. The takeaway is that rupture is both similar and radically different from Lenin's model. Similar in recognizing that discontinuities may be necessary, different in grounding those continuities in a prepared, organized, institutionally supported working class with decentralized development rather than a centralized vanguard party. Revolution for Avineri is always connected to everyday material power, especially institutional power, and existing democratic practices. Let's go back to our Leninist critic of Avineri, Alan Gilbert, who writes about Avineri's reading of Marx. He says Gilbert's Leninist approach might enable us to escape from attributing to Marx the curious view that no revolutionary or political action can make a contribution to socialism until economic circumstances have ripened. Gilbert's basically saying that if you follow Avineri, it looks like Marx is being overly passive, just waiting for capitalism to develop enough before the working class can act. But Avineri would respond that this is a misreading of Marx. For him, the point isn't that revolutionary or political action is irrelevant until conditions ripen. Rather, Marx emphasizes that action must be grounded in the objective conditions of society, the level of productive forces, socialized labor, and economic networks. Political and revolutionary efforts are meaningful, but they are effective only when they engage with these real material conditions combined with organized class consciousness and institutions. In other words, Avineri's Marx is neither fatalistic nor gradualist, and also not purely opportunist or voluntarist. He doesn't suggest passively waiting for history to unfold. Instead, the working class must act strategically, using political power to shape and accelerate capitalism in ways that make socialism possible. Economic conditions set the stage, but consciousness, human intervention, and organization are what transform potential into real social change. So the takeaway is that Marx isn't saying wait for ripeness. He's saying that capitalism has already created the material conditions, and now it's time to act in a way that makes that potential real. It's time to act in a way that makes ripeness matter. Revolution is always both materially conditioned and politically mediated, and Avineri's reading highlights that balance. So I made this diagram so that we can visualize Avineri's path to a worker state that we just explained in detail. But let's summarize before moving on. Like a good materialist, Avineri begins with the material reality in the present, capital's objective tendencies, the universalization of social relations, globalization, proletarianization, and the socialization of capital. These tendencies give rise to class consciousness embedded in material institutions, which then dialectically turn back on and subjectively mediate our material reality, particularly capital. When a class becomes conscious and organizes itself with institutional power, capable of mediating capital, roots to state and further institutional power become walkable. As we pursue roots to deeper power, this process again dialectically turns back on and deepens class consciousness. What's important to notice from a dialectical standpoint is that Avineri's path to a worker state follows the classic triad of unity, difference, and then unity in difference together. If the first two categories are opposites, objectivity and subjectivity, this third category is the union of opposites. Avineri offers paths, legal reforms, institutional power and governance, and revolutionary ruptures where they are feasible. When we say Avineri isn't a determinist, he's a pluralist, it's these last three categories that we're really talking about. But we've yet to talk about one essential aspect of Avineri's theory that spans across all three levels and more, and this is universal suffrage. Universal suffrage for Avineri is more than just voting rights in a bourgeois state. It's the material condition that allows the working class to enter the state as an active force, turning political equality into a terrain for mediating class power and preparing the dialectical overcoming of the bourgeois state itself. Okay, let's take this step by step. Regarding the objective conditions, universal suffrage does not directly arise here, but these tendencies create a mass polity capable of participating in elections and institutional life. At the level of subjective mediation, universal suffrage intersects directly with class consciousness and institutional power. It allows the working class to translate awareness of their shared structural position into political representation and organizational leverage. Through suffrage, workers can influence legislation, finance, and governance, embedding their power within institutions. With roots to state power, universal suffrage is essential for Root 1, parliamentary and legal reforms. It provides the formal mechanism through which the working class can achieve legal, economic, and social reforms that prepare the ground for a worker state. Without suffrage, parliamentary roots are blocked, and reforms cannot mediate capital effectively. With Root 2, institutional power, universal suffrage extends beyond voting for policy reforms to reshaping institutions by giving workers democratic legitimacy to take control of municipalities, public services, cooperatives, and public finance, and to bind elected mandates to unions, councils, and movements. Suffrage provides authorization and legitimacy, while institutions provide capacity and continuity, together enabling workers to govern in practice before holding full state power. And regarding Root 3, revolutionary ruptures, Avineri does not treat universal suffrage as meaningless even here. Before rupture, universal suffrage matters because it politicizes the masses and extends participation and helps build organizational capacity and confidence. After rupture, universal suffrage matters because any workers' state must reconstitute legitimacy on a universal democratic basis rather than vanguard rule. I just want to pause here and offer some more extra credit textual hiking. These quotations support Avineri's reading of Marx regarding universal suffrage as both the path to a worker state and the path towards its withering away. The first quotation from Marx explains how he believes universal suffrage in stable liberal democracies like England can result in or has a trajectory towards a worker state, and this is what we've been talking about. The second quotation from Avineri implicitly critiques the Leninists because Marx highlights the necessary organizational and consciousness-raising preconditions for socialist transformation, and points out a time when Marx actually explicitly prefers peaceful transformation over violent revolution. So because Avineri's well-supported reading of Marx says peaceful transformations are both possible and preferable in certain countries, it's the third and last of the routes to a worker state. I invite you to pause here and read these quotations if you want to see for yourself. Here we have the 10 regulations as they appear in the Communist Manifesto. What's crucial for Avineri is that these are not blueprints for socialism and not emergency measures of a ruptural seizure of power. They are transitional reforms, early expressions of how a worker state begins to transform society through Aufhebung. I've highlighted a few major themes here in bold. First, the abolition of private ownership of land, along with a heavy progressive tax and the abolition of inheritance. In Marx's context, inheritance was the central mechanism reproducing aristocratic and bourgeois class power. Avineri reads these measures as part of the political dismantling of bourgeois rule, not abolishing society, but abolishing institutional mechanisms that reproduce class domination across generations. Second, measures like the creation of a national bank, the centralization of credit, communication, and transportation point directly to the economic socialization of production. For Avineri, this isn't about bureaucratic control for its own sake. It's about bringing the key coordinating levers of modern society under democratic control so crises, speculation, and private command no longer dominate social life. Okay, third, education and the expansion of productive capacity matter because socialism presupposes abundance, literacy, education, and participation. Free public education is not just a social policy, it's a condition for universal suffrage in practice, enabling people to govern themselves consciously rather than being ruled administratively. Taken together, Avineri reads these regulations as early movements toward all three goals of the worker state: dismantling bourgeois power, socializing decisive economic mechanisms, and laying the groundwork for the eventual Aufhebung of the state itself. As democratic control deepens across politics, the economy, and civil society, the state's coercive character begins to dissolve, not by decree, but because it becomes unnecessary. These regulations are not the end of the process, they're how the worker's state begins. We'll go into much more detail on these three main goals in a moment, but first, let's hear this in Avineri's words. How will proletarian rule deliver communism? According to Avineri, it does not rely on sudden revolutionary decrees to abolish capitalism overnight. Instead, the proletarian state accelerates trends already imminent within capitalism, guiding them to full development. Avineri interprets the manifesto's 10 regulations as exactly this kind of strategy. The goal isn't to invent entirely new institutions, but to create the economic and political conditions that render private industry and the coercive state gradually obsolete. He writes, private industry will be allowed to continue to exist surrounded by such a climate of economic and political arrangements that it will slowly, in as peaceful and orderly a fashion as possible, have to transform itself. High progressive taxes, the abolition of inheritance, competition from the public sector, which will no doubt be favored by the state monopoly of banking and transport, All these will slowly ease private industry out, not through one-sided political means, but by gradually creating the economic conditions which will make the further existence of private industry economically unviable. None of these steps suggested here by Marx is by itself novel or revolutionary. All intensify and further develop trends already working within the capitalist system and gradually changing it. Proletarian rule will thus only accelerate the pace of this development and make dominant traits still marginal or secondary in existing society. In other words, the worker state does not smash everything overnight. It works with the logic of capital, its socialized production, its coordination, its infrastructure, while reorienting it towards collective democratic control. Private industry is not eliminated by decree, it becomes economically unnecessary. This is the dialectical Aufhebung at work, preserving the capacities capitalism is created while transcending its domination, moving toward a society where social needs, not private profit, shape production. Okay, now that we've traced Avineri's path to a worker state, the real question is, what is a worker state actually for? For Avineri, it's not simply about redistribution, nationalization, or seizing power. Its purpose is Aufhebung, a dialectical overcoming and transcendence. This implies preserving the real capacities capitalism has created, like globalized social coordination and near universal participation, but now it's time to abolish its class domination, abolish capitalism itself. How? Well, Avineri organizes the goals of a worker state around three interconnected pillars, which we've already mentioned, and these come from his analysis of the Communist Manifesto's 10 regulations. Again, these regulations are not a timeless blueprint, but historical policy recommendations, the spirit of which can reveal what the worker state is meant to accomplish. So we use Avineri to distill this spirit down to three main goals. First, the political dismantling of bourgeois class power. This doesn't mean abolishing democracy, it means transforming it. Capital's grip over the state must be broken, and democratic economic institutions must be reoriented toward collective control rather than private domination. This is what universal suffrage in politics is all about. Second, the economic socialization of production. Not everything is nationalized all at once, but the levers that structure society, finance, infrastructure, major industries are placed under democratic social control, so we socialize key sectors. The point is not chaos, but rational collective coordination without private command. Only in this way can we redirect production and distribution to serve the social whole, not the needs of a few capitalists following the logic of capital. This is universal suffrage in the economy. Third, human emancipation and the self-transcendence of the state. This is the most radical claim. Here we get as close as possible to an anarchist Marx. For Avineri, the worker state is not the final form of society. As class domination dissolves, the state itself loses its coercive character and begins to wither, not through decree, but because it's no longer needed as a separate power over society. These pillars are inseparable. They have a logical order, but in practice, they need to work together. Political change without economic transformation reproduces domination. Economic planning without democracy produces bureaucracy, and neither matters unless the end goal is a society where people collectively govern themselves. For Avineri, the worker state is a transitional form. It's the state to end all states, because its success is measured by one thing, whether it makes itself obsolete. Its authority is self-subverting. Like a great teacher, eventually it becomes unnecessary. The first goal of a worker state is the political dismantling of bourgeois class power. For Avineri, this does not mean abolishing democracy, it means transforming it so that political institutions serve the collective rather than private capital. There are two distinct moments here in this process, positive and negative. First is ending class rule. This is a negative moment because the focus is on removing the structural domination of capital over the state. Corporations, banks, and elites can no longer dictate policy, influence budgets, or skew laws for private profit. Preservation and transcendence are at work here. This is about the preservation of the state's machinery. Parliaments, courts, and bureaucracies provide the framework for governance, but the moment of transcendence lies in neutralizing capital's leverage over those institutions. The working class asserts political authority, ensuring that government decisions serve the public, not private wealth. Think of this as clearing the ground. The state remains, but the old owners of power are removed. The second moment is key. This is about the transformation of democratic institutions. Once class domination is curtailed, the structures themselves must be positively reoriented. Parliaments, municipal councils, and administrative bodies are not simply occupied, they are restructured to operate democratically and inclusively. Workers participate directly through unions, cooperatives, and councils, embedding decision-making power into the institutions themselves. So the moment of preservation here is that the procedural forms and electoral mechanisms remain, or they might remain, and the moment of transcendence is that their function shifts from elite dominance to collective governance. And this is where universal suffrage is really key. It provides the democratic legitimacy to transform institutions and link them concretely to organized social power. In short, the first moment is about eliminating class domination, removing class control, and lobbying influence. The second moment is about reorienting institutions, making them functional, accountable, and participatory. Both moments rely on and build universal suffrage, which authorizes workers to exercise control, but they target different aspects of political power, one structural, the other functional. Aufhebung is the lens here. What's preserved are the forms, procedures, and legal frameworks. What's transcended is their subordination to private bourgeois interests. The result is a state that is politically democratic, capable of collective governance, and ready to serve as the foundation for economic socialization and human emancipation. The result is a state that is politically democratic, capable of collective governance, and ready to serve as the foundation for economic socialization and human emancipation. After workers take power, Avineri argues that the first task is transforming the state to achieve real universal suffrage. This does not automatically mean destroying every institution. In most situations, Avineri believes the working class can eliminate bourgeois class power within the state and then restructure the institutions of the state to serve collective rather than private interests. This is classic Aufhebung, abolishing domination while preserving and transforming what can be used. Listen to how Marx puts this. He says, the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. But this is where Avineri runs straight into conflict with the Leninist tradition. In 1917, the same year as the Russian Revolution, Lenin reinterprets Marx, arguing that the state must be smashed, broken apart, and replaced. This is how he puts it, quote, Marx's idea is that the working class must break up, smash the ready-made state machinery and not confine itself merely to laying hold of it. So for Lenin, existing institutions are structurally bourgeois and cannot be reworked. They must be destroyed. Avineri's Marx agrees that the state cannot be taken over unchanged, but he does not conclude that everything must be wiped away. Marx's point for Avineri is transformation, not pure destruction. The bourgeois character of the state must be abolished, but the administrative and democratic capacities capitalism has developed can be reoriented. In dialectical terms, this requires both negation and reconstruction. Take a concrete example. Lenin would likely argue that institutions like the US Congress or the UK Parliament must be swept away entirely. Avineri's Marx allows another possibility. These institutions may survive only through a fundamental restructuring. In the UK, that could mean abolishing the House of Lords, among other measures. In the US, socialists going back to Eugene Debs and the Socialist Party of America called for abolishing the Senate and democratizing the House. That's not just preservation, it's deep transformation. For Avineri, the real question is not smash or keep, but what must be abolished, what must be transformed, and what can be preserved without reproducing class domination. Now let's move on to the second goal of a worker state, the economic socialization of production. For Avineri, this is not about inventing an entirely new economy from scratch. It means taking what capitalism has already produced, its productive forces, industrial networks, and socialized labor, and transforming them so they serve society rather than being ruled by the logic of private profit. As before, this unfolds through a negative and a positive moment structured by Aufhebung, preserving capitalism's real achievements while transcending class domination. First is the negative moment, socializing key economic sectors. This moment is negative because it removes something, the private ownership and command of capital. But nothing essential to production is destroyed. What is preserved is the fact that capitalism has already made production social in a technical sense. Factories coordinate thousands of workers, supply chains span continents, and infrastructure links entire regions. These are real social achievements. What's transcended is really important. It's the private ownership and unilateral control over these socialized capacities. Railways, ports, energy grids, finance, utilities, and major industries no longer operate solely according to the logic of private profit. Ownership is reorganized democratically through workers' cooperatives, employee-owned firms, public enterprises, and the social ownership of key sectors. The result is a mixed but democratic economy that preserves markets where useful while abolishing capitalism's exclusive ownership of the means of production. The second moment is positive. It's about redirecting coordination towards real social needs. Here, the focus shifts from ownership to purpose. What's preserved are the technical and organizational capacities of capitalist production: scale, coordination, productivity, and efficiency. Markets may still function, money still circulates, and production for exchange still continues. Capital, understood as the production of surplus through organized labor, does not disappear overnight. What changes is its status, really, or function. Capital is no longer the sovereign logic of society. It becomes one coordinating mechanism among others, alongside ecological limits, worker safety, social reproduction, and collective well-being. Production is no longer governed by competition alone, but by conscious, democratic decision-making. So what's transcended is the reification of capital, the condition in which both workers and capitalists are compelled to obey an abstract, impersonal logic of accumulation. Instead, production and distribution are deliberately oriented toward housing, transportation, healthcare, sustainability, and communal needs, even where these do not yield immediate profit. This is where economic socialization becomes universal suffrage in the economy. Just as political suffrage democratizes the state, economic socialization democratizes civil society, the economy. Humanity no longer exists for capital. Capital becomes a tool governed by collective decision making. That is the economic core of Avineri's workers' state. Not chaos, not bureaucratic command, but democratic control over the material conditions of social life. Universal suffrage extended into the economy itself. Democracy at work. Now we come to the third and final goal of a worker's state, human emancipation and the transcendence of the state. For Avineri, this is the most radical and most misunderstood claim in Marx's political theory. The worker's state is not the end of history. It's a transitional form whose purpose is ultimately to abolish the conditions that make a coercive state necessary in the first place. Once again, this unfolds through a negative and a positive moment structured by Aufhebung, preserving what is necessary for collective life while transcending domination. First, the negative moment, dissolving the state as a separate power over society. This moment is negative because it removes the state's coercive alien character. What's preserved is coordination. Large-scale societies still require administration, planning, law, and collective decision-making. Avineri is explicit. Marx does not imagine society collapsing into spontaneity or chaos. What's transcended is the state as an autonomous apparatus standing above society, an institution whose authority rests on class domination, bureaucracy, or some other kind of coercion. As bourgeois class power is dismantled and economic life is socialized, the state increasingly loses its function as an instrument of rule. It no longer governs over society, it begins to be absorbed into it. Second, the positive moment is about collective self-governance and human emancipation. Here, the emphasis shifts from what disappears to what emerges. What's preserved are the universal capacities capitalism helped create, which have now been fully developed by a worker state: mass participation, social interdependence, and the ability to consciously regulate collective life. These are real historical achievements, and Avineri insists they must not be lost. What's transcended is alienation. Political power no longer appears as something external to individuals. Administration becomes a shared social function. Decision-making migrates into democratic institutions embedded in everyday life: workplaces, communities, councils, and associations. This is the abolition of the separation or contradiction between the state and civil society. This is where Avineri's Marx comes closest to what people call anarchist, though Avineri never abandons organization, law, or coordination. The state does not vanish overnight. It withers as its coercive role becomes unnecessary. Authority becomes self-limiting or self-subverting. Human emancipation, then, is not just economic security or political rights, it's the end of a world where people are ruled by forces they themselves produce: capital, bureaucracy, or the state. The worker state succeeds precisely to the extent that it makes itself obsolete. In Avineri's terms, this is Aufhebung in its fullest sense. The state is preserved as coordination, transcended as domination, and dissolved into collective self-rule. Now we can see why universal suffrage plays such a decisive role in Avineri's theory. At first, universal suffrage appears as a material precondition of a worker state. It enables political participation, legitimizes reform, and allows workers to contest power within existing institutions. But once the workers' state begins to take shape, suffrage becomes something more. It turns into the lever that makes institutional transformation possible. In the state, and in the economy. In that sense, universal suffrage does not stop at elections, it deepens itself. As democratic control expands into public administration, economic coordination, and civil society, suffrage is no longer just a political mechanism, it becomes a social principle, the generalized capacity of people to participate in governing the conditions of their own lives. For Avineri, this process has a dialectical endpoint. When democracy is fully realized, when participation is no longer mediated by a separate ruling apparatus, the state begins to sublate itself, just as capitalism did in earlier historical transitions. The ultimate extension of universal suffrage, then, is not the perfection of the state, but really its Aufhebung, or maybe those two are the same. Avineri explains this by drawing on Marx's analysis of the Paris Commune. He writes that, based on universal suffrage, the Commune approached the stage at which the distinctions between state and civil society begin to disappear. This is crucial. The Commune did not simply replace one state with another, it began to dissolve the separation between governing institutions and social life itself. Here, Avineri is working with Hegel's framework of ethical life, family, civil society, and the state. For Hegel, freedom requires balance among these spheres. Marx's critique, however, is that under capitalism, civil society, structured by the economy, dominates the others. Market relations deform both the family and the state, subordinating them to capital. Avineri's claim is that universal suffrage in both politics and the economy can finally overcome this distortion. As democratic participation extends across all spheres, no single one stands above the rest. At that point, universal suffrage completes its own task. By dissolving the distinction between state and civil society, it abolishes the state as a separate power. This is not the end of collective organization, but the beginning of genuine human emancipation. Before we wrap up, I want to give some direct textual grounding for Avineri's claim that universal suffrage is what ultimately sublates the state, that it leads to the state's Aufhebung rather than its simple destruction. Let's begin with this well-known passage from Engels, quote, "The interference of the state power in social relations becomes superfluous in one sphere after another, and then ceases of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and the direction of the processes of production. The state is not abolished, it withers away." This already tells us something crucial. Engels is not talking about smashing the state by decree. He's describing a process in which the state, as a power standing above society, becomes unnecessary because its functions are absorbed into collective self-management, especially in the organization of productive life, which underlies all social relations. Now, here is Avineri interpreting and deepening this argument. He writes, Marx makes the abolition of the state as a separate organization contingent upon universal suffrage. In realizing the determination of the political sphere by the whole public, universal suffrage abolishes the distinction between state and civil society, and thus abolishes the state as a particular organ divorced from the totality of economic real life. The Aufhebung of the state is thus made possible only after the political structure has utilized all of its potentialities. The universality underlying Hegelian political philosophy will thus be realized only when the state itself will be aufgehoben, abolished, transcended, preserved. Realization of the Hegelian philosophy of the state is made possible only through the abolition of the state. This passage captures Avineri's core insight. The state is not abolished before it is fully democratized. Universal suffrage must first be realized in practice, politically and economically, so that the distinction between state and civil society dissolves from within. Only then can the state wither away, not as an act of destruction, but as a consequence of its own fulfillment. That is the dialectical endpoint of Avineri's Marx, a state that succeeds so completely in democratizing power that it makes itself obsolete. We can now step back and see the full arc of Avineri's theory, from how a worker's state becomes possible to what that state is ultimately for. Avineri begins with a three-part path to a worker's state. First are the objective tendencies of capitalism. Capitalism universalizes social relations, globalizes production, proletarianizes almost everyone, and creates universal interdependence, but under private command. These material developments generate the possibility of collective control, even as they intensify exploitation and alienation, and sometimes worse. Second is subjective mediation. Objective conditions alone aren't going to take us there. They must be taken up by workers through class consciousness and organizational power. Consciousness names a shared structural position. Organization stabilizes it in unions, parties, cooperatives, councils, and mass movements. This is where universal suffrage first appears as a material condition, making collective self-representation possible. Third comes a plurality of routes to state power. Avineri rejects any single road theory. Parliamentary reform, institutional power building, and rupture are all historically possible and contingent. What matters is not the form, but whether these routes mediate capital toward democratic control and deepen universal suffrage rather than foreclose on it. Once a worker state emerges, Avineri then asks a second question. What is it for? What are the goals? Here again, the answer unfolds in these three interconnected goals. First, the political dismantling of bourgeois class power. This does not abolish democracy, it transforms it. Capital's grip over the state is broken. Institutions are restructured, and universal suffrage is made real rather than merely formal. This is Aufhebung at the political level, preserving democratic forms while abolishing class domination. Second, the economic socialization of production. The productive capacities capitalism created are preserved, but private command is transcended. Key sectors are socialized, coordination is redirected towards social need, so democracy enters the economy itself. Universal suffrage now extends into civil society, the economy. Third, human emancipation and the self-transcendence of the state. As democratic control spreads across social life, the state loses its character as a power standing over society. Authority is absorbed into collective self-governance. The coercive state withers not by decree, but because it becomes unnecessary. Taken together, this is Avineri's core claim. The worker state is not an endpoint, but a transitional form whose success is measured by its ability to abolish itself. Its purpose is Aufhebung, preserving what capitalism made possible, and the worker state deepens but abolishes its domination and opens the space for genuine human freedom. Its purpose is Aufhebung, preserving what capital made possible, and the worker state deepens, but abolishing its domination and opening the space for genuine human freedom. Okay, thanks for going on this journey with me. I hope Aveneri's attempt to go beyond both revolutionary and evolutionary Marxism has been fruitful for you. I hope to see you on the discussion board bringing your comments, critiques, and questions. Next time, we'll go into a crucial contemporary question, which is about capitalism and the environment. Let's see what the manifesto can teach us about Marxist environmentalism. We'll do this by comparing and contrasting eco-socialism with degrowth communism. Thank you for joining.